and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. Alexander the Great defeats Ahasuerus and chases him across the straits into Asia Minor from Greece. Verse 4, but as soon as he is arisen, that's Alexander the Great, you have the end of the Persian Empire in verse 2, you have the rise of the Greek Empire in verse 3, and you have the collapse of the Greek Empire in verse 4. Now, we know that Alexander the Great rose and pushed his armies around 333, 334 BC across and ran clean across over into India in the space of 4 or 5 years. And finally, in about 327, his soldiers and armies were so exhausted, and he encountered a place called what we call Afghanistan today, and he got a little bit over into India. And because of the terrain, he gave up and turned around and came back to the capital of Babylon, where he died. Alexander the Great dies, and what happens next is found in verses 5 through 20. Verses 2 through 4 cover from 535 BC to 323 BC. Now, in verses 5 through 20, you have the king of the north and the king of the south. And they're running back and forth, doing battle with each other. And this span covers maybe about 150 years. Now, in those days, of this particular period of history in verses 5 through 20, everybody kept the same name. Antiochus is a common name used to the rulers of the kings of the north. The Ptolemies are the kings of the south. When Alexander the Great's empire is parceled out, you get something, and there was a map there, if you can go back to it. The empire of Alexander the Great extends all the way over to a place called Bactria, which is the far right side there. And there's a river that runs down through there. That's where he got stopped with his empire. The green part is what is known as the Seleucid Empire. This is the area that the kings of the north control. The little brown area down south there on the bottom part of the map that runs from Israel down around across the Nile or the Red Sea opening, and then the Nile Delta and up around the coast of Africa there a little bit, that's the Ptolemaic Empire. Ptolemy was a general that in the early days, as the Alexander the Great's empire was split apart, Ptolemies took control of the southern part. The Seleucid Empire is the huge part of landmass that is the king of the north. The other two parts were the parts of Macedon and Greece in Europe, and then Lysimachus controlled a little part of the European coast and the part of the Asia Minor coast, what is known as Turkey now. So that's how the horn on Daniel 7 gets broken up into 4 little horns, and there it is. And the king of the north and the king of the south are different kings as we work through those verses. But it's that same landmass that gets run over all the time. Guess who's in the middle? Still in the middle today. Israel. There are exactly 2 ways to get from the area of the Seleucid Empire in the north down to the Ptolemaic Empire in the south. There are exactly 2 ways to get there if you move by land. To the best of our knowledge, they had no airplanes or balloons at that time. So they couldn't fly over it. So they had to march there. The first way you get from the Seleucid Empire down to the Ptolemaic Empire to stop or repel an attack is that you go along the Mediterranean Sea coast, you cross over the Carmel mountain range, and go down the sea coast along the Mediterranean Sea, down in through what is now known as the Gaza Strip, across the Sinai Peninsula, and into the Ptolemaic Empire. The other way that you go is you cross over the Zagros Mountains and come down over what is now known as the Golan Heights in Syria and drop down into what is known as the plain of Megiddo. And it's a clear run across the plain of Megiddo all the way to the northern hills of Judea and the hills of Samaria, and then you go right through Jerusalem on your way down to Egypt, to the Ptolemaic Empire. So in verses 5 through 20, you have a period of about 150 years of complete unrest and war between two generals who 150 years earlier had fought together with Alexander the Great. And now they're doing land grabs. Learned something very interesting about the history of war in humankind. That most wars are fought over boundaries. Now, I don't know why I like history, and I don't know why it never crossed my mind to think in those terms, but much of the unrest in all of Daniel's visions is an issue of boundaries, of possession. And so what you have in verses 5 through 20 is an ongoing 150-year battle between the kings of the north and the kings of the south. And one comes and dies, and the another one comes up, and another one dies, and the other kingdom, and it's back and forth. It's push and shove. And sometimes the kings of the north prevail, and sometimes the kings of the south prevail. Now, there was a tactic in place for a very long time before this, that a way you achieve peace with a warring nation that you wanted to achieve peace with, and you didn't want to deplete, both sides didn't want to deplete their armies, they figured a way to solve that problem was to get married. I suppose nobody ever studied the history of marriage. Because if you want to create peace, you ought to know better than to think that marriage is going to achieve that for you. And there's some very interesting intrigue that it takes place in these verses, and some interesting thoughts that take place in these verses. As you read through them, and we're not going to read through all of them this morning, just simply note that from time to time, the king of the north prevails. From time to time, the king of the south prevails. And the land grab that they're always going for is the area between Jerusalem and Damascus. That area is always embattled in this. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And sometimes there's some political intrigue, and there's some arranged marriage in here that's interesting to read about. And the amazing thing is, exactly as the angel tells Daniel, it unfolds in history. But Daniel's hearing this and writing this down, and it's never happened yet. Verse 5 is interesting. The king of the south will grow strong along with one of his princes who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion will be great. After some years, they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement, but she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power. What's fascinating is that there is an alliance formed between one of the Ptolemies and one of the Seleucid kings. And in order to achieve this, one of the kings gives his daughter in marriage, thinking that he will gain influence with the southern kingdom by giving his daughter in marriage to the Ptolemy's son, who is 5 years old. It's an arranged marriage. It's a political arrangement. It's a peace treaty. And in so doing, Antiochus the Great thinks, I will gain advantage and eventually have an heir set on the throne in the Ptolemaic kingdom, and will be one kingdom. And so he gives his daughter in marriage. And then all of a sudden, there's another plan that hatches, because that king dies in the Ptolemaic Empire, and another arises, and now we have to go through the whole process again. This time, the Ptolemaic king, has a wife already. Her name is Laodice. And Antiochus the Great sends his daughter Berenice to be married to the Ptolemaic king. And he has to divorce Laodice. And Laodice is banished to an island off of the coast of Egypt. And Berenice, the daughter of Antiochus the Great, bears a son. Now here's where it gets interesting. This is exactly what happens in verse 5. That phrase there, verse 6. They will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. Antiochus the Great gets the daughter, and he thinks, I'll have a son set on the Ptolemaic Empire then if she bears a son. The interesting thing is, Laodice has Berenice and that infant son assassinated. She comes to power and sides with the Ptolemies. And literally what that verse is forecasting is the death of Berenice and her infant son. She comes to no power. The arranged marriage doesn't work. Again, history simply proves that a providential God who 300 years before it occurs predicts it comes to pass. You move on. Verse 7, one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place. He will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and display great strength. Also their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold he will take into captivity to Egypt. And he on his part will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. Then the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south, but he will return to his own land. Another skirmish occurs. The Ptolemaic kingdom comes into the kingdom of the north, sacks all their precious metals and gods, which are simply the wealth of that kingdom, bring it back to Egypt. That Ptolemaic king dies, and the king from the north comes and sacks his country and carries off stuff. And away you go, back and forth, verses 10 through 13. Again, the prevailing battle between the Ptolemaic kingdom and the Seleucid kingdom, kings of the north and kings of the south, they battle back and forth. And again, who's in the middle? Israel is. And all the time, Israel is getting run over, either by the Seleucid kingdom of the north or the Ptolemaic kingdom from the south. It's this battle between the north and the south here that is pitched, and Israel's in the middle constantly. One country and then the other country come and conquer them, and then demand taxation, then demand certain things. Now we come down through verse 20, and that begins the end. But something very interesting happens in verse 14. In those times, many will rise up against the king of the south, the violent ones among your people. Who in the world is that talking about? That's simply talking about a group of Jews in the northern part of Israel that side with the Seleucid king and rise up against the Ptolemaic kingdom. They pick sides, these Israelites do. They rise up among your people, will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. In other words, when they pick the side, sometimes you pick the wrong side. Verse 15, then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege ramp, and capture a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south will not stand their ground. What happens is one of the Ptolemaic or Seleucid kings comes down to Sidon, which is being controlled by the king of the south at that time, lays a siege against Sidon and conquers it. Sidon sets on the seacoast of the Mediterranean Sea. Whoever controlled Sidon controlled the flow of troops along the Mediterranean Sea coast. Otherwise, you force them to come inland and go down through the plain of Megiddo. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land with destruction in his hand. One of the Ptolemaic kings comes up and lays siege to Jerusalem, the beautiful land, and conquers it. He will set his face to come with power in verse 17 of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which we will put in effect. He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand and be on his side. Again, arranged marriages don't work. And so in verse 19, so he will turn his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and be found no more. The last Ptolemaic king to launch an attack on the Seleucid Empire eventually is confronted with the fact that he can't defeat the Seleucid Empire, and he turns around and retreats back to Egypt, to the Ptolemaic Empire. Now you are down to a contemptible person in verses 21 through 35. This is a very protracted passage that deals with one guy by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And Antiochus Epiphanes IV was called by his own soldiers and generals Antiochus Epimanes. Epiphanes means blessed one, illustrious one. It's a title that he gave himself because he thought he was a god. But his own generals and soldiers called him Epimanes, which means madman. So while his own view of himself was one of great virtue and almost deity, his own soldiers didn't think that. But verses 21 through 35 deal with Antiochus Epiphanes. Verse 20 says, "Then in his place one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom." That's a reference to Israel and Jerusalem. "Yet within a few days he will be shattered, though not in danger nor in battle." That is the reference to the king in verse 19 that loses the battle and goes back to Egypt. Verse 21, "In its place, the Seleucid king that defeats the Ptolemaic king and sends him back to Egypt is now the successor to that king is found in verse 21. "In his place, a despicable person will arise." The English Standard Version calls him a contemptible person. Antiochus Epiphanes IV in Greek history is known as a ruthless, crazy leader. He does exactly what he wants to do, and he spares no one in his path. "So in his place a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue." He wipes out all the people who are in line rightfully to inherit the Seleucid Empire, and by intrigue, he captures it. One of the interesting things about Antiochus Epiphanes is in the Ptolemaic Seleucid Wars, when one of the Seleucid kings is defeated by the Ptolemies, Antiochus Epiphanes, the second son of Alexander the Great, in the deal that settles the peace treaty between the Seleucid and Ptolemaic Empire, when the Ptolemaic Empire prevails, is this: you will pay a tribute of 1,500 talents a year. It's a massive amount of money. Number 2, you will forfeit all your lands. Number 3, you will retreat back to the line that you came from, and we will take this land. And then the last part of that arrangement of the peace treaty was, you will send 2 of your sons to Rome. And Antiochus Epiphanes is taken to Rome. And he spends his formative years in Rome. And what does he learn in Rome? He learns how to fight like a Roman. And when he gets on the battlefield in verse 21 here, he is a contemptible person, despised even by his own generals and his own army. Then in verse 22, much like the tactics the Romans have begun to employ, the overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. He makes a deal with one of the leaders in Jerusalem. Only he breaks it. And his army tactics are like the Roman army. You crush everything in sight. You leave nothing. Then he goes on down through verse 24, "In a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he'll accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time." Here's how Antiochus Epiphanes holds loyalty. He bribes people. "I'll give you this land if you won't fight against me. I'll do this, I'll do that." He simply negotiates a peace treaty, always in his favor. Sound familiar? Hasn't changed in 2,000 years of history, 2,500. Away we go then. On he goes. Verse 26, "Those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain." Simply this: there are those who so dislike Antiochus Epiphanes, they will rise up against him and try to defeat him. They do not succeed, and many will fall down. There is a great slaughter by Antiochus Epiphanes, both of those that he considers his people that he's made peace treaty with, and his own enemies, the enemies of other people, meaning the Israelites. Many will fall down slain. And then in verse 27, "As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time." In other words, the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid treaty established by Antiochus Epiphanes IV falls apart. They lie to each other, they attack each other, it all falls apart. Verse 29, "At the appointed time he will return and come into the south, but this time it will not turn out the way it did before." In other words, Antiochus Epiphanes moves against Egypt and the Ptolemies to fight them. He passes Jerusalem. He loses the battle. Why? Because a country by the name of Kittim is mentioned in this passage. Kittim is a reference to the ships of Rome. And now you have another world empire introduced. One predicted in Daniel chapter 2, with the legs, with the feet of iron mixed with clay. It's interesting. The queen of the Ptolemies Empire at that time was a gal by the name of Cleopatra. Not the Cleopatra of Mark Antony. She comes later. Like I said, everybody likes the same names in this period of time. When you talk about a Ptolemy, you better figure out which one it is. If you talk about a guy by the name of Antiochus, you better figure out which one it is. You wonder why we write history books? It's because there are 4 published works of Greek historians and Roman historians and 1 Jewish historian that document the silent years between Malachi and Matthew. It won't turn out the way he wants. In verse 30, for the ships of Kittim, that's a reference to the Roman Empire. Kittim is a series of islands in the Mediterranean Sea that was held by Rome at this time. They will come against him, and therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged again. If you know anything about this bit of history, you know that the Roman general Publius met Alexander in a negotiation at Taphanes in Egypt. And he drew a circle around him, and he says, you got to decide what you're going to do before you step outside of the circle. You're not leaving here alive until you decide and tell us what you're going to do. And he says, I'll go back home. And he retreats. But that's what verse 30 is. Disheartened. He will return and become enraged. Notice what happens here in verse 30. He sees he has a battle he can't win, and he gets ticked off. We know he's a ruthless conqueror of people. So what's he do in verse 30? He turns around and he heads back north. He becomes enraged at the Holy Covenant. He's made an agreement with the high priest in Jerusalem. They're buying off Antiochus Epiphanes to allow them to continue their worship. At this point in the history of Antiochus Epiphanes, he is so mad that he breaks the covenant he has with those people, those leaders of the Jews in Jerusalem. Notice what he does. He takes action, so it'll come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. In other words, if you jump to my side and come to my side in the battle against those insurrectionists within the confines of Israel and Jerusalem, if you'll take my side, you'll prosper. In other words, it's a bribery. Join my side. Forces from him will arise and desecrate the sanctuary fortress. They go into the fortress of the temple and they destroy it. They desecrate it. Verse 31, and do away with the regular sacrifice. We know this occurs in 167 BC. He goes in and he kills the high priest. And by the way, the high priests for over 100 years have bought the office. They've paid off the Seleucid rulers to keep their high priest position and carry on their worship. That's very important in the history of the Gospels. I'll show you why in a moment. Anyway, he ends with the regular sacrifice. He breaks his own promise to them, and they will set up the abomination of the desolation. Antiochus Epiphanes takes a statue of either Zeus or Jupiter, depending upon how mad he is at the Romans. Zeus if he's really mad at the Romans, or Jupiter if he's not so mad at the Romans. You see, Zeus is the Greek god of supreme power. Jupiter is the Roman god. Whichever one he sets up in the temple holy place, it is a pagan god. It's a pagan idol. And it's called, in verse 31 then, the abomination of desolation. You want to remember that phrase. Verse 32, by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. You want to stop right there in verse 32 because that refers to the period of the Maccabees. Now the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees are not in our Bible because they do not pass the test of canonicity. But they are of great historical value. They tell us the day-to-day goings-on of the battles that are waged in this period of time. And the reference to those who know their God and will display strength and take action refer to the people who defend the cause of Jehovah in Jerusalem during this time. Verse 33, those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by the sword, by flame, by captivity, by plunder for many days. If you read the last few verses of Hebrews chapter 11, you discover that many of these people were drawn and quartered, literally cut in half, brutally murdered. And these people who are called the Hasidim, the people of acts of righteousness, literally try to convince their own countrymen to resist, and they fail, and they are slaughtered. In the day the abomination of desolation took place, Antiochus Epiphanes' forces killed 8,000 Jews, men, women, and children, in the city of Jerusalem. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. Verse 36 through verse 39 now takes us to the time of the end. The time of the end. Just quickly, there are some who view verses 36 through 39 as being partially fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And I would say that's plausible. It could be true. But not everything in verses 36 through 39 does Antiochus Epiphanes IV fulfill. It refers to a yet future ruler who will act like Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Now notice with me as we move into verse 36. Then the king will do as he pleases. Well, that's already been said about Antiochus Epiphanes, so that could be referring to it. He will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. That doesn't fit Antiochus Epiphanes. Why? Because Antiochus Epiphanes puts a statue of a god he worships in the temple. The descriptive there in verse 36 is that he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and in particular against the God of gods, Yahweh. And he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. That could refer to the demise of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Read on with me in verse 37. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women. Those two phrases have always plagued the interpreters of that passage. Pretty much the first phrase, he will have no regard for the gods of his fathers, is whatever the ancestors, whatever the past cultures were, he doesn't care. Past history has no effect upon him. That's what they're saying. I don't care what happened in the past. That he has no desire for women may refer to Antiochus Epiphanes because he was known as a profligate, immoral, adulterous, fornicating human being. And he would mistreat and kill those women. It may mean that. It may mean this guy has no allegiance or affection even for his own mother. And some take it the next level and say that he may be a reference to a homosexual. That seems not plausible at all to me here. One way or the other, this guy doesn't care about past history, about past cultures. He's only interested in himself right now. There's nothing that will influence him. You can't ply him with an arranged marriage. You can't ply him with all the things that human leaders are plied with in order to curry their favor. Nor will he show regard for any other god, any god at all. In other words, this man appears to be completely irreligious. To him, religion is a non-factor. For he will magnify himself above all. That's a very important line there at the end of verse 37. In the eyes of this king, there's no one but him. There are no false gods. There's not even the God of gods that the Israelites worship. There is no one but him. He is the final, absolute authority. Verse 38 tells you what he will honor. He will honor a God of fortresses. What does he worship? Raw power. Military might. Henry Kissinger said it a number of years ago. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is the epitome of this guy. Move on with me now. And he will honor with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. In other words, He will dispose all available financial resources to obtaining power. Spend money on anything else other than fortresses? Not him. That doesn't fit with Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Verse 39. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses with a foreign god. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge and will cause them to rule over the many and will parcel out land for a price. This person, in some ways, reflects what Antiochus Epiphanes does. Only, we said he's irreligious. He doesn't care about any other god. He is God. Yet it says in verse 39, he will take action against the strongest of forces with the help of a foreign god. Let me move you fast forward to the book of Revelation chapter 13. There you have the great dragon and his associate, the false prophet. It's an accurate description there in verse 39 of something still yet future to us. Verses 40 through 45 simply describe a person yet to come in human history. Yet to come in human history to Daniel, yet to come in human history to us. There is a phrase here. In verse 40, I want you to pay attention to. It's occurred earlier in the chapter. It's the phrase at the end time. The latter days is what it's translated out of Hebrew. Again, that passage, that phrase occurs in chapter 9. It describes what happens in the 70th week of the vision that Daniel sees in Daniel 9. The 70th week of Daniel 9 is still in front of us today in 2021. Yet here you have, as you come down to the end of Daniel chapter 11, 300 years of history yet in front of Daniel. Daniel has no way of knowing when he gets this bit of information whether or not it'll happen in the next 10 years, 5 years, or 2,000 years. I want to end with explaining to you something that happens. I told you about it in the period of the Maccabees, where those who know their God take strength and take action. They were called the Hasidim, those who act in righteousness. That group of people splintered out into three different groups at that point in time. One group was known as those who took care of the law, those who were the keepers or doers of the law. Those who observed the righteousness of the law. Those people came to be known as the Pharisees. There was another group that came out of the Hasidim that decided the best way to deal with foreign occupation was to negotiate with the conquering armies. That group became known as the Sadducees. And then there's a third group that believed the only way to deal with the world was to go isolate themselves, and they did in the caves of Qumran, and they were known as the Essenes. And you will run headlong into them in the Gospels. And you will discover that what takes place in 300 BC with the Seleucids coming down and holding the worship of Israel hostage to taxation endures into the 1st century AD. And when you read about the Sadducees and the Pharisees in the Gospels, please know that this battle's been going on since the time of Alexander the Great. And over 150 to 200 years, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes entrenched themselves in the cultural life of the Israelites. Now, there are three key questions to ask yourself as we wrap this up this morning. First of all, what is the reason for the spiritual warfare that Daniel is experiencing in chapter 10, 11, and 12? What's going on behind the scenes, behind the words of history yet in front of Daniel and passed to us? What's going on now that we don't see? What's going on in the battle among human events and nations and rulers around our globe that are unknown to most people? They don't have a clue. Yet Paul tells the Ephesian people in chapter 6, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against against forces and principalities and powers in heavenly places. There's an unseen battle going on since Adam and Eve and before. What's the cause of the spiritual warfare? The plan of Satan from the inception of creation and Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is to derail the plan of God. And what is the plan of God once Adam and Eve fell? It was always, and before they fell, it was always to provide redemption through His Son, Jesus Christ. What is the ultimate step that Satan wants to stop here in Daniel 11? He's tried wiping out the children of Israel in Egypt, and by famine and by warfare, on and on and on. And you get up to Daniel, and now it's a promise of Daniel, restoration of Israel, and Daniel wants to know if they're going to rebuild Jerusalem, and God says yes, and He shows how. And just as Bob sang this morning in the song, I Plead Calvary, because Paul says in Ephesians 1, before the foundations of the world and the universe were laid, God ordained this to happen, that His Son would die for the sins of humanity as creatures. Why is this battle going on here in Daniel? Because again, it's a last-pitch effort of the forces of evil and sin and Satan himself and his minions to stop the plan of God from occurring. 55 years after Cyrus passes off the scene, Ahasuerus and one of his henchmen by the name of Haman tries to obliterate the children of Israel in the book of Esther. And then it's Antiochus Epiphanes. And then it's Titus the Roman general. And then. What is the plan of Satan today to prevent the plan of God from succeeding? That means there can't be a nation of Israel on the face of the earth for Jesus Christ to return to. You want to know what's going to happen? Well, do you trust God or not? Because He's told you. He's told you. And the pitch battle in Daniel 11 is the pitch battle of Satan trying to prevent the plan of God from succeeding, the restoration of Israel to His homeland. Because God had said in the book of Jeremiah, 70 years and I'll bring you back. Why is Daniel 11 important to you and to me? Because if I believe in a high view of the Bible, which I do, and if I believe that what God said to Daniel in 535 BC is dead accurate, and it is historically proven to be so, then what should I think about what's happening in our world today and happening in the future in front of us? And what is my main concern? Which side wins? No. I don't care which nation wins against which nation. Obviously, I want to protect the country I live in. That's born to it. But in the greater scheme of things, do I understand as a follower of Jesus Christ that this isn't home for me? I've got another place I want to get to. And it's that kingdom that is prevailing all the time. And it has an infinite investment in the salvation of human beings. The reason for the spiritual warfare in Daniel 11 is the restoration of believing remnant to Israel, culminating in the attempted extermination by Ahasuerus, Xerxes, in the time of Esther and Haman. Satan still continues that war. From 455 BC, when Haman tried to exterminate the Israelites, to Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 BC, to the present day, 2021, to however long human history continues to move forward. Satan, beaten already, we plead Calvary all the time. He's already been done, bested, but he keeps on fighting. He's worse than the Energizer Bunny. He keeps on going and going and going. Why? Are there two contemptible persons? Yes. The description given to Antiochus Epiphanes is simply a description of a second contemptible person known as the Antichrist or the Beast. He's described in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, Revelation chapter 13, Revelation chapter 16, Revelation chapter 18, 19. Are there two contemptible persons? Yes. One was Antiochus Epiphanes. History proves that and confirms that. So does Daniel chapter 11. Is there a second contemptible person? Yes. He is the guy who will do the abomination of desolation. He is the guy who will break the treaty He makes with the nation of Israel. He is the guy who, after 3.5 year period of the 70th week, 7-year period, will make himself God in the temple of Jerusalem. The king of the north. What's his motif? What's his modus operandi? What's his means of operation? He simply is a God of power. There's only one thing he worships, that's power, and himself. When you read the book of Revelation, you discover that the narrative of Daniel in these visions fits almost dovetail into the events of the book of Revelation. Now, here's my question to you this morning. Can you watch the news? Therefore, having been justified through faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, we have peace. The king of Salem, the prince of Salem, is the Prince of Peace, because that's what the name Shalom or Salem means. No human machinations are any match for the battle we don't see. That's why Daniel studied the Bible, the scriptures, and prayed relentlessly. And he followed it up with being a righteous man. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I can't tell you what's going to happen in 5 minutes. I can't tell you who's going to win the Super Bowl because I don't care. I can't prognosticate about anything with any intelligence at all. But I can tell you who knows the beginning from the end. I can tell you who is the beginning and the end. And I can tell you that individual, Jesus Christ himself, knows everything in between. And it will occur exactly as he has said and he allows. So go home, enjoy your meal, enjoy your Valentine, and quit worrying about the future. Because if you follow Jesus, you're on the right side of history. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your grace to us. Thank you for your love for us. Thank you for giving us your word. Thank you for the encouragement we gain from one another. Thank you for the encouragement that the Spirit of God brings into our life through the power of the word and prayer with you, prayer with one another. Thank you for those who for many more years than I have prevailed in being faithful to follow you. I thank you for their testimony, their example, and the path they've blazed for me. May I do that for succeeding generations as we walk towards the culmination of your great plan. Can we trust you? Absolutely. Daniel did. Will you keep your word? Absolutely. You did with Daniel. You will with us. May we always, in all ways in our lives, give honor and glory to you. You are indeed the God of gods. Amen.
There is a Redeemer, Jesus, God's own Son, precious Lamb of God, Messiah, Holy One. Thank you, oh my Father, for giving us your Son and leaving your Spirit till the work on earth is done. Jesus, my Redeemer, name above all names, precious Lamb of God, Messiah, oh, for sinners slain. Thank you, oh my Father, for giving us your Son and leaving your Spirit till the work on earth is done. When I stand in glory, I will see his face. There I'll serve my King forever in that holy place. Thank you, oh my Father, for giving us your Son and leaving your Spirit till the work on earth is done. Have a great week. You're dismissed.